In 2017, a $1.3 billion port in Sri Lanka was handed to China on a 99-year lease after debts spiraled out of control. By 2025, 53 African countries will owe billions more, drawn in by over $1 trillion in Chinese Belt and Road loans, no questions asked, no oversight required. Behind the promise of a new Silk Road, entire nations are risking their ports, mines, and futures as collateral. How did a wave of no-strings-attached financing create a debt trap capable of reshaping Africa? The answer begins with a single empty port and the decisions that followed. Hambantota was never meant to be a cautionary tale. In 2004, Sri Lanka's leaders, still reeling from the devastation of the Indian Ocean tsunami, pinned their hopes on a new deep-water port. India and the United States passed on the project, citing poor economic prospects. China stepped in, offering $1.3 billion in loans with few questions asked. Construction moved quickly, and by 2010 the port opened its gates to the world. But the ships never came. With Colombo's main harbor already handling most of the island's traffic, Hambantota's massive terminals stood nearly empty. Losses mounted, over $300 million by 2016. Annual debt payments reached $59 million, far outpacing the port's earnings. Unable to keep up, Sri Lanka struck a deal in 2017. A 99-year lease to China Merchants Port handed over an 85% stake for $1.12 billion. The agreement included 1,235 acres of surrounding land and control over a key point along vital Indian Ocean shipping lanes. For many in Sri Lanka, the deal became a symbol of lost sovereignty. In 2021, Foreign Minister G. L. Paris called it a mistake, warning that the lease could be extended to nearly 2 centuries. Hambantota's story set a precedent, showing how easy credit could turn into decades of foreign control when promises outpaced reality. In 2013, President Xi Jinping announced a vision to link Asia, Africa, and Europe through a vast network of infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative promised to fill Africa's annual gap of $93 billion in roads, railways, ports, and power. By February 2025, 53 African countries had signed on, drawn by China's pledge of over $1 trillion in global investment. Unlike Western lenders, China offered loans through its Exim Bank with few governance requirements, allowing projects to move quickly from blueprint to construction. For leaders facing crumbling roads and unreliable power grids, the appeal was clear. According to data from the China-Africa Research Initiative, Chinese lending to Africa soared, peaking at $16.2 billion in 2018. Projects ranged from massive hydroelectric dams to transcontinental railways, each sold as a catalyst for economic growth. Deborah Brautigam, who has tracked these flows for over a decade, notes that the scale was unprecedented. No other creditor matched China's reach or speed. Yet the landscape began to change. By 2023, Chinese commitments in Africa had dropped to just $4.6 billion, a fraction of earlier highs. The early rush left a continent dotted with new infrastructure, but also mounting debts. As repayments came due, the promise of transformation collided with the reality of fiscal strain. The Belt and Road's continental pitch had delivered grand ambitions, but it also set the stage for a reckoning. Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway stands as one of the largest infrastructure projects on the continent, with a price tag of $4.7 billion. High-speed trains were meant to link Mombasa to Nairobi, then stretched to Naivasha. The original feasibility study, authored by Chinese engineers and consultants, projected 22 million tons of freight annually. That promise never materialized. In practice, the line has managed only about 5 to 6 million tons each year, barely a quarter of what was forecast. Trains often leave Mombasa loaded with imported goods, but the return journey to the coast is mostly empty, exposing a trade imbalance that undercuts the railway's business case. The railway's route was supposed to extend through Uganda, Rwanda, and beyond, transforming East Africa's trade. Instead, construction halted 468 kilometers short of the Ugandan border when China stopped financing further expansion. The line now ends abruptly in the Rift Valley, surrounded by fields rather than factories or freight hubs. Freight costs remain higher than trucking for many businesses, especially given the added expense of last-mile delivery from remote depots. The gap between projection and reality is stark. Kenya's flagship railway, designed as a backbone for regional commerce, now struggles with underused tracks and mounting losses. The mismatch between optimistic forecasts and actual demand has left the country with a costly asset that cannot pay its own way. Kenya's annual payments for the standard gauge railway now top $1 billion, a figure that dwarfs spending on health or education. In 2025 and 2026 alone, the government must pay $741 million in principal, $222 million in interest, and an additional $41 million in penalties, costs that pile up even when trains run empty. These payments account for 81% of Kenya's entire foreign debt service. The burden is so severe that nearly 7 out of every 10 shillings the government collects go straight to debt repayment. The International Monetary Fund warns that anything above 30% threatens a country's fiscal health, and Kenya is more than double that threshold. In October 2022, Kenya missed a scheduled payment, triggering a penalty of $10.8 million, according to the Auditor General's report. The same audit flagged these penalties as an improper use of public funds, yet the contract terms left little room for negotiation. A 2020 court ruling declared the original deal with China Road and Bridge Corporation illegal, but the financial obligations remained in force. Leaked documents suggest that Mombasa Port, a key national asset, was pledged as collateral, raising fears that a default could cost Kenya more than money. By late 2025, Kenya agreed to convert its dollar-denominated loans to Chinese yuan, a move that could halve the interest rate from 6.37%, but also deepens the country's dependence on China's financial system. For now, the country remains locked in a cycle of payments, penalties, and uncertainty, with the stakes growing each year. Copper runs through Zambia's economy like a lifeline, making up 70% of the country's export earnings. But as Zambia borrowed heavily to fund new roads, stadiums, and power plants, the bills began to stack up. By 2020, external debt had reached $17.3 billion, with Chinese lenders holding between $6 billion and $6.6 billion across 18 separate loans. The debt-to-gross domestic product ratio soared to 96%, and when the pandemic hit, Zambia became the first African country to default on its sovereign debt. Ownership of Zambia's mineral wealth shifted quietly during these years. Chinese companies now control 85% of the Luanshya and Chambishi copper mines, and they hold a majority stake in the nation's only nickel mine. As repayments faltered, reports surfaced of Chinese creditors seeking fresh collateral in the form of mining assets. Contracts tied copper export revenues directly to debt service, diverting funds from public budgets. For communities near the mines, the impact is felt in the air and water. Pollution controls weakened, and acid runoff from mining operations has left rivers contaminated. Ministry data shows school budgets in Luanshya fell by 18% between 2021 and 2025, forcing teachers to manage larger classes with fewer resources. Health clinics report a 30% rise in skin ailments linked to toxic waste. The promise of development now competes with the daily costs of debt and environmental harm. Contract terms in Chinese loans rarely see the light of day. A 2021 analysis of more than 100 agreements found that 75% contain strict confidentiality clauses, blocking public oversight. Escrow accounts are common, forcing governments to channel project revenues or even export earnings directly into China-controlled accounts before any funds reach national budgets. In nearly one-third of cases, borrowers waive their right to sovereign immunity, making it possible for lenders to seize foreign assets if payments stop. Cross-default clauses can trigger immediate repayment if a country falls behind on any other loan, multiplying risk across entire economies. Arbitration is often locked to Beijing, further tilting the balance of power. These mechanisms now loom over a continent facing an unprecedented wave of repayments. Developing nations owe China $1.1 trillion, with $35 billion due in 2025 alone, including $22 billion owed by the world's 75 poorest countries. 12 African nations are already in debt distress. Restructuring efforts are underway in Ghana, Ethiopia, and Chad, while Zambia only exited default in late 2025 after years of opaque negotiations. As Kenya and Zambia shift their debts from dollars to yuan, dependency on China's financial system deepens. The Lowy Institute warns that China will be more debt collector than banker for the rest of the decade, as health and education budgets risk being squeezed by the coming tidal wave of repayments. Today, African nations owe China $100 billion, with debt repayments now outpacing spending on health and education in the poorest countries. As Beijing shifts from builder to debt collector, the real price is not measured in infrastructure, it is measured in sovereignty. The next chapter is still being written.